Hi, guys and gals. So we are starting our psychology unit, chapter 1. And so I want to give you a little introduction into psychology and also talk to you about some of the different theories that have come about. There are basically 7 major theories in psychology. So we're going to look a little bit at those and then we'll look in more detail as we get later on in the class. So I thought I would record these for you that are at home today. So, the 7 approaches to psychology. Go ahead and fill out your notes as we go. And just remember that you can always pause these if you need to take more time to put notes on or skip to wherever you are in our notes. Okay? All right. So, first of all, we need to define some of these words for your test. So, what is psychology? It is the scientific study of behavioral and mental processes. So, we're studying behaviors and we're studying mental processes of the brain as well. Why do we do what we do? And different psychologists believe different things caused our behaviors. Okay. Of course, today's psychologists aim to describe, explain, predict, and influence how we think, feel, and act by using the scientific method. This should be nothing new for you. You've used the scientific method for years in biology, but we also do this in psychology as well. And if you look at the poster over here on the right, you'll see we start with a question. What do we want to answer? We have our hypothesis, then we experiment, then we observe and record, then we analyze our data, and then, of course, we share our results so that other people can learn from us and then take on where we left off. Okay? A scientific study is when psychologists use the scientific method to validate those studies. I mean, it's one thing to say, I believe that serial killers do what they do because they were abused as children. But it's another to actually take data and really scientifically prove that information. A behavior is any action that other people can observe or measure. So notice we have to be able to see it or measure it. And a mental process includes cognitive activities such as dreams, perceptions, or memories. And that's obviously very difficult to measure unless you write it down or you tell us about it. So, for example, psychologists have tried to interpret dreams. So we're going to keep a dream journal later on this semester and see what we think your dreams mean, but we have to write those down in order to do that. Okay? All right, here are just some of the questions that psychologists try to answer. And I think some people don't even realize how big this topic is. Like, why are you like your parents? What do babies understand and when do they start understanding it? What are your dreams about? Who becomes leaders and why? Is depression normal? Are people from different cultures the same? Who dominates conversation, men or women? These are just a few of the topics that you might choose when you decide to do your own experiment this semester. Okay, so psychology gets its roots way, way back in the 1800s. It started with a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. Wundt opened the first psych lab at the University of Leipzig in 1879, and he believed in structuralism. Basically, what he did is he used introspection, looking in, to explore the elemental structure of the human mind. So you had to look inside to figure out what's going on in the human mind. That was his idea. Functionalism focused on how behavioral processes function, behaviors, how they enable organisms to adapt, survive, and flourish. Another guy kind of added on to this functionalism idea, and that was a guy named William James. He was interested in the purpose of our behaviors. Like, for example, why do women in the 1800s tend to be subservient to men? Is that something that is innate within them, or is it something that is environmental? Okay, he started looking at that kind of stuff. Then a guy named Sir Francis Galton came up with a really new idea, and he started tracking heredity in families and the environment. He is nicknamed the father of eugenics. Now, this was even before we took IQ tests. He tried to measure intelligence by using reaction time tests, and he believed that greatness ran in families. that if your parents were fast in these tests, then obviously you were going to be fast and your children were going to be fast. So he believed it was handed down by generation hereditarily. He even said that we should get rid of less desirable families that were not as quick to answer. Where does that sound familiar? Getting rid of the lesser people. If you said Hitler, you're right. It was kind of the same idea, this idea of eugenics, that you keep procreating the upper level and that you get rid of the lower level. And it started with Sir Francis Galton, actually, not Hitler. He forgot to look at some really important factors that we know today. But he was the first guy to actually ask that question. He forgot to look at income. Obviously, if you have money, you have education, or you have that option anyway. So that would have an impact. Education, of course, as I said, and even the environmental factors. There's a difference between an immigrant who lives in inner city New York as compared to an immigrant who's sitting in our class in Brandon, South Dakota, and is surrounded by other students that already speak English, as an example. So the 7 main approaches are the psychoanalytic theory, invented by Sigmund Freud, the behavioral theory that was invented by B.F. Skinner, Ivan Pavlov, and John Watson, the cognitive theory done by Jean Piaget, the humanistic theory done by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, and then you have the sociocultural theory, the biological theory, and the evolutionary theory. And we'll be looking at some of these famous people a little bit later, okay? All right, so here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you each of these approaches, and then I'm going to try to give you an example that will help you remember it. So let me move my picture up here so you can see the pictures below. Okay, we're going to start with the behaviorist approach. Now remember, these people believed that the effect of the environment shapes your behavior. Now, it doesn't deny the role of heredity, obviously. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Hold on a second. But you can't do anything about that. We can alter the environment. We can't alter our heredity, who our parents are. It emphasizes learning by using like reinforcements and punishments. So, for example, these people believe that we are trained by rewards and punishments. So if your parents want you to make your bed, maybe they give you an allowance each week so that you make your bed, and it trains you to be neat by the time you're an adult. If you are late for your curfew, parents might punish you by grounding you, for example, or taking away your PlayStation. And again, the idea is to learn, to teach you to learn that it's important to be on time when you say you're going to be there. Okay, those are behaviorist ideas, reinforcements and punishments. Our second theory is the biological approach. These people seek to understand behaviors by studying underlying neurological, biochemical, and neuromuscular causes. They're actually looking at the brain itself and the chemicals and the things that happen to your brain and what causes behaviors. So, for example, they might study the effects of brain damage, the whole concussion issue with the football players that are going on right now in the pros. That's a really big area in psychology. Injecting hormones obviously would affect your behavior. So an example of that might be depression. Obviously, there are chemicals in the brain that cause depression. So they would assume that some of those things are why we act the way we act, or why we do what we do. Okay. This is another example. Stroke victims, for example, they can really change their personality. I don't know if any of you have known someone that's had a stroke, like a grandfather or something like that, but a lot of times their personality changes, and it's because of parts of the brain aren't getting the blood flow that they used to, and so it affects their personality. That's a biological approach. The third one is the cognitive approach, and this group kind of focuses on how we encode, process, store, and retrieve information. We basically are figuring out how we remember things, how we get those memories out of our brain, what happens in the brain itself. They focus on the mental processes that intervene between the stimulus input and the response output. So, for example, have any of you used a mnemonic device? Like you see over here, remember when you studied the planets and they gave you a certain clue to remember that? My very educated mother just blah, blah, blah. I had a different one than that, but you can come up with mnemonic devices to remember things for your test. That would be a cognitive approach, a way that we remember things in our brain. Number 4 is the psychoanalytic approach. Now, this is a Freudian theory. For example, Freud viewed our unconscious as our primary determinant of behavior, that there are things within our brain that we don't even realize sometimes are causing our behavior. Our thoughts and actions are caused by suppressed instincts. So, for example, and this is kind of a controversial theory, a lot of people don't believe it, but it was a new way to think. He believed that little girls secretly are envious of their fathers, and so they secretly want to be men, or they want to be like men. Thus, the reason they like bananas or curling irons. I hope you can figure out that connection there. So, just one of many different theories that they have in the psychoanalytic approach. Number 5 is the humanistic approach. And this one is kind of a positive one in some ways. These people believe that human behavior is the result of free will. You have the choice. And they believe that overall humans have a basic goodness and an innate motivation to achieve your full potential. So, for example, why do athletes want to try to get that first prize trophy or that medal? It's because innately we want to be the best that we can be. Why do you strive to get that new job at work or that promotion? Because we're striving to be the best we can be. That would be the humanistic approach. Number 6 is the sociocultural approach. And it looks at how behaviors and thinking vary across situations and cultures. So it is somewhat environmental, but our culture is what affects us. So, for example, one of the things that I have heard from my students is that there's a lot of pressure in Brandon, South Dakota to go to college. How many of you would agree with that? Yeah. And if you look at our culture, it kind of makes sense. Brandon has a very odd amount of 2-parent homes, first of all. We have a very wealthy town, which is not typical of most towns. So a lot of our people in this town have been to college. A lot of people have more than one parent that went to college. And therefore, there's this expectation that that's what you should do because you live in a town like this. That expectation would not be the same in Phoenix, Arizona, for example. In the town I was in Apache Junction, half of my class, graduating class, I didn't go there, but I taught there. Half of their class did not make it through high school. So 8th grade graduation was a really big deal in their culture because most of their people were lower economic group, had not been educated beyond high school and didn't see why. So it was a very different culture. All right, number 7 is the evolutionary or sociobiological theory. Okay. Darwin's theory of natural selection is an example of this. They explain behavior patterns as adaptations naturally selected because they increase reproductive success. Now, I know that's a lot of words, but let me basically give you an example. Have you ever noticed that in the Midwest, there's a lot of obesity in males and females? Okay. Well, if you look at that, I mean, you could trace that back to our roots because we're Norwegian or Swedish. And think about those countries where we came from. They were up north. It was really cold. And in order to survive those long winters, you had to have fat on your bones to survive. You just did, or you would die. And you notice that in South Dakota or Minnesota, we have longer winters than we do further south. So we tend to have a little more obesity here because we have, well, first of all, we kind of lock ourselves in our houses in the winter. and we tend to eat and don't exercise as much. Whereas if you go to like Phoenix, Arizona, you'll find there's much less obesity because the warm weather is longer and people tend to be outside more and they tend to be more active. That would be an example of how that area we've adapted to where we're living and our group of people. Okay? Not saying it's true everywhere. Like, for example, Mexico has a higher obesity rate. Can you guess why? It's got great weather, just like Arizona. But the food they eat is also really high in fat. So again, that would be more of a cultural thing that makes them a little different. Here are just the 7 approaches and some sample questions that they might ask, like neuroscience, how are messages transmitted within the body? How is blood chemistry linked with moods and motives? Evolutionary theory, how does evolution influence behavior tendencies? Behavior genetics, to what extent are psychological traits like intelligence, personality, sexual orientation, and vulnerability to depression attributed to our genes? Is depression something we carry on from generation to generation? How about to our environment? Psychodynamic, how can someone's personality traits and disorders be explained in terms of sexual and aggressive drives or as the disguised effects of unfulfilled wishes and childhood traumas? Again, those are those drives that are in our heads, that caveman instinct that Freud would talk about, that drive who we are. Behavioral people, how do we learn to fear particular objects or situations? Why are we scared of spiders or snakes? Where does that come from? What is the most effective way to alter our behavior? Say, to lose weight or stop smoking. Cognitive theorists, how do we use information in remembering, reasoning, or solving problems? How do you remember how to do that math problem on the test? And sociocultural, how are we as Africans, Asians, Australians, or North Americans alike as members of a human family? And how are we different because of our environment and our cultures? Okay? So I'm going to give you some other examples and have you discuss some of these. So again, behaviorism, how we learn observable responses. It involves, again, reinforcements and punishments to shape our behavior. So for example, how do we learn to fear particular objects and situations like a spider or a snake? Go ahead and write down that answer right now. Discuss with your partner. What are effective ways to stop smoking or losing weight? What are some things that we do to make that happen? Go ahead and answer those questions. Obviously, we've been taught since we were little, we watch people go, ooh, it's a snake. And so we fear that. But there actually have been studies that show if you teach a child that this snake is in this box and he's the most lovable creature and he hugs your arm, it's so sweet. Kids aren't afraid of snakes. We are taught that from our culture and our environment. What are some ways to stop smoking or losing weight? Hypnosis would be an example of that. That when we're stressed, for example, we don't eat. Maybe we try to alter that by exercising instead, or playing piano, or going for a walk. Okay, just some different examples. Biological. Remember how the body and brain enable emotions, memory, and sensory experiences. So for example, how are messages transmitted within the body? How is blood chemistry linked to moods and motives? So I'd like you to talk with your partner about how PMS is an example of a biological trait. If you said that PMS is caused by an overload of chemicals in our body during certain times of the month, you are correct. It is a real thing. It is a chemical thing. Now, the cultural misconception is that every woman has PMS, and that isn't true. We all have different amounts of chemicals in our body that would create that or not create that environment. Psychoanalytic or dynamic theory, how behavior springs from our unconscious drives and wishes. Can personality traits and abnormal behaviors be explained from sexual and aggressive drives or as disguised effects of unfulfilled wishes and childhood traumas? So let me give you a case example. I have a teenager who sleeps with all kinds of men, sleeping with a lot of people. Why do you think that girl is sleeping with many men? What might be causing that from her unconscious drives and wishes? Now, I'm speaking from experience of a friend of mine. She was honestly looking for her father. Her father was not in her life, and she was always looking for that recognition or that love from that man in her life that wasn't there. Um, so in her case, she started searching that out by sleeping with different men. Now, there can be other reasons, but in this case, that would be an example of a psychoanalytic example. Humanistic or positive psychology. How do we measure, understand, and then build human strengths to help people thrive? All of us have that capacity to choose, to change, and control that direction in our lives. That's the humanist idea. We try to build wisdom, love, and hope in a self-directed manner. So I want you to write down, what is one way you have bettered yourself as a human being? And in class, of course, we would share that. So, cognitive theory. How do we remember, encode, process, store, and retrieve information from the brain? How do we use information to solve problems, remember, or reason? For example, why does a child learn not to touch a hot stove? Think back to your childhood. Discuss with your partner what makes us not touch that stove. Well, you probably said it either included that you touched the hot stove and burned your hand and it hurt, so we learned not to touch the stove, or our mother or father grabbed us and scared us, said, "No, don't do that," and yelled at us. And of course, that's that fear of being yelled at and being scared like that as a little child taught us, you don't want to touch that hot stove because that's what mom or dad does when you do it. Sociocultural, how behavior and thinking vary across situations and cultures. How are we, as Asians, Africans, North Americans alike, as members of a human family, as products of different environments, how are we different in behavior? So, with a partner, I want you to list a couple ways that all of our different groups, different cultures, are similar as human beings. And then I want you to list a couple of examples of how we're different. Okay, just some examples. As human beings, we all believe in family and we love our loved ones. That would be an example of how we're similar. Um, we all want a good life. We all want better for our children and a better world. How are we different? For example, the Asian culture tends to really respect their elders more and reveres them, and usually they live within their home. So that changes their culture a little bit as compared to North Americans. Even the way we dress is different, and our behaviors are expectedly different in Europe as compared to in Africa or in the Middle East. The Middle East, because of our culture, we tend to cover the skin because of religious reasons. In Europe, nudity on TV is pretty much an open thing, especially topless. So, kind of depends on your culture. And that would be it for today. Thanks for joining me, and we'll talk to you again later. Bye bye. Okay, where'd it go? It's supposed to come up. If I just did all that and it didn't work, I'm going to be really mad.